The way we wanted to structure the conversation today, or in this session, is to have three different kinds of people here on the sofa. One representing a multilateral agency, both a lending and a donor agency, that is focused primarily on development and poverty alleviation, but with a very strong emphasis on sustainability and environment. And that's George Ledec for the World Bank. We also have somebody representing a multilateral agency with a facilitation role, linking agencies with governments and donors to try and strengthen our focus on funding for conservation issues, and that's Jan McAlpine. And then myself representing a private foundation with a very specific focus on great apes and funding, well, actually all apes, and we consider all the apes great, so including the smaller apes, with a very specific focus on conservation and the well-being and welfare of apes in captivity. George Ledec is the lead ecologist in the Africa region of the World Bank. He's been working with the bank since 1990 and focusing specifically on biodiversity issues as they are related to economic development. He started in Latin America and the Caribbean and is now focusing specifically on Africa. Jan McAlpine is the director of the United Nations Forums on Forests, and it includes 197 countries as members, and it addresses every aspect of forest policy. And really the function is to facilitate discussion between donors and agencies and governments so that people will see the importance and relevance of forest issues. We're going to start with a brief presentation from both George and Jan McAlpine, and then I will also give a short summary of the focus of the Arcus Foundation. But what we've heard over the last 3 days so far has been really about how incredibly complex the challenges are for conservation and the well-being of apes. And that we need to have both boots on the ground as well as efforts to address the demand side on the consumption of natural resources. And there has to be a very strong investment in people, both in the local communities, as well as in the conservation people working on the ground, as well as in governments, and that includes range state governments, as well as governments in the countries that are extracting from range states. There has to be a very strong emphasis on governance, and we need to engage early and in a very strong way with industry so that best practices are followed. And this really leads us to realize that there has to be an integrated approach to conservation. Conservation is phenomenally complicated and complex. It's not a single issue problem, and there is no single issue solution to conservation. And we need to form partnerships and collaboration and focus by working all together. And this partnership and collaboration is not just for the organizations trying to achieve conservation, but also for the organizations who want to fund and support conservation. And so there's an emphasis on the donors as well to collaborate and to think together and to understand how complex the issues are and how integrated and holistic the approaches need to be. So what we'd like to do during this conversation today is not give you a presentation of some of the innovations that we might have thought up on funding, but really have a conversation with you about what innovations are required to be able to address these complexities and to be able to ensure that conservation is effective and that all the multitude of different things are addressed and supported and funded. And that's why we have three very diverse funders sitting here. And we can't speak for all the multilateral agencies or all the private funders, but we can try and speak from that perspective and listen, most importantly, to what the conservationists and the people working on improving the well-being of apes in captivity tell us so that we can improve the way funding is provided and the maturity and the intelligence of the way funding is provided. So that's really the goal, and that's why we were hoping you would come close so that we can have a conversation and you can ask us lots of questions and give us lots of ideas. and that we can maybe respond to some of those questions and ideas where we think we might have an answer. Yeah? So I'd like to give George Ledec the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the World Bank, since it's a big and complex organization. George? Actually.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So I want to talk a little bit about what is the World Bank doing for great ape conservation, particularly in the context of mobilizing funding. World Bank is an international organization owned by its member governments. Most countries in the world, with very few exceptions, are members of the World Bank, and the bank provides assistance for development to developing countries, the developing countries among its member countries. And the World Bank's mission is essentially poverty reduction. And for the time that I've been at the bank, that's which has been quite a long time, that's always been it. The latest version, the latest iteration of the mission statement is to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. So that's sort of the context that we're starting with. The World Bank does not have a strategy for conserving great apes. It does not really have a strategy for any species group other than humans. However, we do have an environment strategy and various strategies that look at different parts of environment. For the Africa region, this serves as our strategy. It's a summary of what we've been doing and what we want to be doing, called Towards Africa's Green Future. And there are handout copies on the counter in the adjacent room, which I encourage you to take if you haven't taken one already, which provides an overview of what we're doing in the Africa region. So with respect to funding opportunities, I want to mention sort of three broad areas. The first is dedicated conservation projects. The World Bank helps countries to implement conservation projects. A lot of this comes from the Global Environment Facility, where the World Bank is one of the implementing agencies, and so we helped to essentially transfer that money to governments for projects that include protected areas and other kinds of biodiversity conservation, other measures that include, in the Africa region, some that have benefited great apes, particularly Uganda and Gabon. There are projects that recently concluded that have done a lot to strengthen the protected area system, and great apes, among a great deal of other biodiversity, have benefited. There are new projects under preparation too, including one in Democratic Republic of Congo that should be very positive for great ape conservation. Beyond the GEF, we try to, we encourage governments to borrow for conservation, particularly at the soft loan rates, which the poorest countries are eligible for, what's called IDA, International Development Association. It's a challenge because as long as grant money is available, governments prefer to go for that for conservation. But in some cases, particularly Mozambique, in the case of protected areas where the country sees real potential for increased tourism, they're also taking our loans or credits. So second area is, beyond the dedicated conservation, is mainstreaming biodiversity within our development projects and planning. And most of what we do is not dedicated conservation projects. It's infrastructure, it's education, health, things in lots of different sectors. And so how do we integrate biodiversity into that, including great apes in the countries where the great apes occur? One is through our safeguard policies. We have a variety of environmental safeguard policies. The ones most applicable are the Natural Habitats Policy of the World Bank, and our private sector affiliate that works with private industry, the International Finance Corporation, has something comparable called Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. And I have a PowerPoint handout which basically describes what the natural habitats policy does and the forest policy of the World Bank, which is closely related. So I encourage you to take that. It provides an overview. But essentially it says, avoid damaging any critical areas from a biodiversity standpoint, and other areas, other natural habitats, try to avoid it if possible. If it's not avoidable in terms of meeting the project objectives, try to minimize it, try to restore areas, and where there's still significant adverse residual impacts, support a conservation offset, which I'll get to in just a minute. In general, if we can get large infrastructure projects to do something for biodiversity, that's a lot of new money potentially for biodiversity. If you have a $100 million project or a $1 billion project, not all of which would be World Bank funded, but the World Bank often helps to get other sources of funding together. We have some convening power in that respect. You know, if you can get 1% of that, or 2% for conservation, that can make a big difference. So we try to do that wherever possible, even beyond just offsetting damage, but trying to enhance, trying to do positive things through the project for biodiversity. And also to help countries with planning. When there are new dams being planned or new roads, try to do it in a way to minimize the adverse impacts on natural habitats and biodiversity. So now with offsets, that's, I think, another area where there's potential for significant new money for biodiversity conservation. One specific example was mentioned in the previous session when Ray Victorine talked about the Lampangar Dam in Cameroon. That was a case of being able to have a conservation offset, say, okay, well, the dam is going to flood some natural habitats, and but the damage can be offset by supporting another area of comparable, or in this case, greater conservation value, the Deng Deng National Park, and providing a source of funding. And one useful thing about hydroelectric dams is if they're operated by well-run utilities or well-run entities, they generate revenues, and a small fraction of those revenues can help to support the recurring costs of the protected areas. Because often for those of you who work with protected areas knows, one of the big challenges is just keeping the recurring costs budget going. It may not be a lot of money in absolute terms, but it's absolutely critical. So we're trying to get offsets used more, and in that context, we just were able to start up a study to produce a biodiversity offsets toolkit and source book, which basically would make, it's intended to make biodiversity offsets easier to understand and more accessible to World Bank staff, to other development professionals, so that this becomes used more often. Up to now, it's been used largely in hydroelectric projects, occasionally with roads projects, but we'd like it to be used more widely where there is damage to be offset, and particularly in the case of the private sector. We have a situation where there are some extractive companies, mining, oil and gas, that have deep pockets, that are willing to put money into conservation, but often the transaction costs are very high. Sometimes the government policies are not favorable. A mining company might say, well, we've got this concession, we want to mine half of it and save the other half for the chimpanzees, and government might say, if you don't use your other half, we're going to award it to someone else. So there are challenges to make this happen, but what we're hoping to achieve, or the people working on this study anyway, is to make it easier to do something called aggregate offsets, where it's not just project by project, but at a national level, there can be a mechanism for taking money from multiple mining companies, multiple agribusiness companies, and using that money for previously designated areas to help make sure that they function properly, to establish new areas, to filling gaps with conservation. And so we're looking to support offsets both at the project-by-project level, like in the case of the Lampangar Dam, and at the aggregate level. So that's what this study is geared towards doing, and we're going to have as part of the study, we're planning to have produced roadmaps for 2 countries, Liberia and Mozambique. Mozambique doesn't have great apes, but Liberia does, and in both cases, we're hoping to get some positive results eventually from that. And then finally, the third area I want to mention is in the area of climate change and trying to mobilize financing for that. Now, that's a tricky area. Climate change is a really big deal in terms, since it's emerged on the stage, it's become, if you pardon the cliche, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I know there are people in the room who actually know how much a gorilla weighs, but climate change has really dominated the discussion on environment, and people who work on biodiversity often wish that we could get comparable attention to biodiversity because it's also a global crisis with irreversible adverse consequences. But climate change has made available money, and some of that money can be used positively for biodiversity conservation, such as with the RED program, Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, which provides an opportunity to have areas kept as forests that otherwise might be converted to agriculture or other non-forest uses. So, and the bank is working actively to try to make the most of the RED initiative. And just to close, speaking on a personal note about climate change, I think one of the challenges that we have is to try to make sure that money to address climate change, mitigation as well as adaptation, is spent in a biodiversity-friendly way, such as for RED, where if it's done right, it's really a win-win. It's good for biodiversity, it's good for climate change mitigation, helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, some of the climate funding and initiatives has been used for things that are harmful to biodiversity, and the case that has come up again and again at this conference is in the case of we know what a problem palm oil expansion is in great ape habitats. Part of that, as I understand it, is driven by a market for biodiesel, particularly in the European Union, which developed, I think, misguidedly from the perception that somehow, because biodiesel is renewable, it's low carbon and environmentally friendly. And it's a case of where good science wasn't used to make policy. The polite way to put it is that the policy got ahead of the science. But I think that's where those of you who are scientists and those of you who are in conservation organizations with an advocacy role can play more of a role in trying to make sure that good science actually gets made into policy so that we don't have debacles like we're having now with biodiesel and palm oil. Okay, I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, George. And Jan, would you like to talk to us a little bit more about the United Nations Forum on Forests?
Thank you. Well, unlike my 2 colleagues here, UNFF is not a funding body. In fact, it's not an implementing agency either. But what it does do is bring together a diverse set of organizations and actors to speak to and work with these 197 governments and talk about policies, laws, policies, regulations, as they impact on forests. Now, since the inception of the multilateral forest agenda at Rio Zero in 1992, the biggest fight in forests has been over funding. And so I'm going to just sort of take you down another road and talk about, to some extent, where some of the confusion and problems arose. My father was born in 1921, and in 1921, worldwide and within countries, basically forest programs, almost exclusively, with some exceptions, dealt with the exploitation or the logging of those forests. And the programs run by governments were focused on how to get more logs, how to make more income. even in the United States, and certainly in say, Central Africa, for example, or Asia, where there are large forests, or Latin America, subsequently, funding for forests by governments really was structured on the understanding that those forests produce timber, and the timber would sort of fuel, to some extent, the ongoing management. And the government was willing to put in money because of the GDP coming out of those forests from logs. However, you know, the whole landscape has changed. And what we found, and the United Nations Forum on Forests, when I became director 5 years ago, I set out to actually see what do we know about where forest financing is coming from. And one of the biggest problems was that there was a big focus on forestry, meaning people who manage forests for silvicultural purposes, and not, say, looking at funding from biodiversity sources or for mining or transportation. I mean, all of these have pluses and minuses, but it's still money going into and related to forests, both positive and negative. So I embarked on a 4-year study because my role with the United Nations on Forum of Forests is to direct my secretariat, the staff, to develop background papers. We work with experts worldwide, and we also work with a group of 13 other multilateral organizations, which includes UNEP, the World Bank, FAO, and other entities multilaterally who relate to forests and climate change. And in this respect, we worked with the CPF members and with experts to try to assess what do we know about how much money is coming into forests, or where are the gaps. Some of the results of these studies are that there are an enormous number of countries who have had declining funding over the last 20 plus years. Significant decline in being able to manage those forests. And even though climate change, the RED program that George referred to, was a really big catalytic, had a big catalytic role to start flowing money to forest projects, it was, as he implied, largely focused on afforestation and not, and they did not allow for paying for natural standing forests. So this disincentive built into the RED program still exists. And while there are some safeguards having, for example, to do with indigenous forest communities who live there, there's a flaw in the climate change framework and concept, which is that it's largely focused on carbon benefits, and natural standing forests are left out. And then there are other issues which George touched on that also provide perverse incentives. And so the money being spent by these donors, and most donors now, for example, DFID in the United Kingdom, everything they do, including on forests, has to come under the chapeau, the rubric of climate change. So one challenge, one adaptation we have to make in order to innovate is to make this connection to climate change. The World Bank, too, huge focus on climate change, which then influences where they spend money. The second sort of policy context you should be thinking about is already understood by the scientists who have participated in the Great Apes Summit here this week, and that is that we no longer can work in a single sector, if you will. We cannot just look at forest financing and think that that's the end of the story. Moreover, donor financing is declining overall in many areas. So private sector role, which George already talked about, is going to be critical, and how to really hook the forest sector industry business to come in and to actually get involved is a challenge. But there are some ways this is happening. I'm speaking next month in London to a timber industry group, and trying to find out what are their obstacles, what are their opportunities to engage. We estimated in the study, which you can find, studies which you can find on the United Nations Forum on Forests website, just Google UNFF, and the estimate was that there's a shortfall of about $400 million a year in just the forestry sector. And that doesn't touch on issues like Sarah's presentation yesterday about the use of drones, for example, to be able to monitor more effectively what's happening, not only with great apes, but also with the habitat in which those creatures live. The numbers, and I'm working with the World Bank, the forest people, and with UNEP and other agencies to see how can we actually get a real grasp of, pardon me, Doug, how can we get a real grasp of what are the actual numbers we need? And so your community, it would be very helpful if you could actually get together and start to put in some data on what are the needs for financing, what are the program areas, how do they connect? And I strongly advocate that GRASP take on this role and facilitate and catalyze that. I believe that will lead to more effective targeted funding, and that's certainly what the United Nations Forum on Forests concluded.
Thank you very much, Jen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Arcus Foundation as one private foundation that is focusing specifically on ape conservation and well-being. The Arcus Foundation has 3 goals, and they're described in this pamphlet, which some of you have already picked up, and there's a few more out there. And I won't go into too much of the detail on the strategy, but really we're focusing on apes throughout all their range states, all across tropical Africa and Southeast Asia where you have apes. We're also focusing on apes in captivity, in range states, as well as in the United States. We're not at the moment focusing on apes in captivity in other non-range countries, and that's only because that's enough on our plate right now. We have 3 goals that we focus on, and the first has been coming out so clearly from this conference. It's the need to reconcile socioeconomic development with conservation and find ways of achieving conservation that's compatible with those development goals. The second goal is to build a stronger and more integrated conservation movement and to try and find ways to help organizations work together more effectively, building capacity, building networks, whatever it is that's required. And the third goal is to improve respect for the intrinsic value of apes, and that has a lot to do with education and awareness and just understanding that they have a legitimate place on this planet. Now, those are our goals. We work across all the ranges. We try to work relatively equally with all the taxa, the gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, chimpanzees, and gibbons and siamangs. Obviously, the needs are enormous, and it's not possible for the foundation and the funds that the foundation provides to respond to all the needs. So there's been an effort to try and really focus on priority landscapes, but we don't want to just focus on large, pristine areas of forest, because the real world in much of this, across much of ape range, is not about big blocks of forest that are untouched by people. So we're also working in fragmented forests, forests that are mosaic landscapes where there is agriculture, where there are logging concessions or mining concessions, roads, villages, and patches of forests with apes in them. And then we're also trying to work in those isolated forest patches that are tiny little bits of forest surrounded by a sea of human habitation. And we try to balance it equally across all those 3 types of landscapes, because it's important that we know how to make it succeed in each of those 3 types of landscapes and not just the big untouched blocks. If I was to describe the ideal program that the Arcus Foundation would like to fund, then it would be one with an integrated, holistic approach, where all the different pieces are working together, where development issues and governance issues and conservation issues and science issues all working together. It would be one that had a long-term vision and a long-term plan, and we would be willing to make long-term investments in that. And then thirdly, it would be one that would be collaborative, where there's different organizations actually working together. One of the big challenges we have in conservation is that we have to compete for funds. And as Jan has said, and as we all know, those funds are limited, and it's hard to access them. And it forces us to compete with other really good organizations, and other organizations working maybe really close to where we're working. And that's unfortunate, because that gets in the way of good conservation. And what we really would like to, and everybody knows they should do, is work together and balance the different skill sets and have them all come and complement each other. But donors don't really allow that either, because most donors, they support an organization in a place, and they want somebody to take responsibility, and they give the funds to that one organization. What would be nice is if donors would fund collaborative projects and say, let's get a group of organizations to work together and let us fund that group of organizations, understanding that they all have different skill sets, different strengths, and different things that they can bring to the success of the project. So these are some of the sort of descriptors of what we would consider an ideal program to fund. Now, despite the fact that in the bigger scheme of things we are quite small, I think probably most of you know that the Arcus Foundation, in relative terms to other foundations funding specifically Great Apes, is quite large. And the Arcus Foundation is putting in approximately, and it changes a little bit from year to year, $9 million per year to support ape conservation and well-being around the world. So it's a significant amount of money. And there are fantastic projects that have benefited from that funding, and many of you are here. So the other thing we've taken on is to try and bring in new donors, and to try and entice, by telling stories of what we have invested in and what we think are successful programs, to entice other donors to join us and to work with us. And we formed what we've called the Partnership for Great Ape Conservation, the PGAC, and we've brought in a number of new donors into that group. And through that initiative, new money has come to ape conservation, money that wasn't there for apes before. And these are donors who have probably always wanted to support conservation efforts in Africa and Southeast Asia, but didn't know enough about it to feel confident that they could, or didn't know who to fund or which organizations to support. But by partnering with another donor, they felt more confident and were able to put in more money. So one example that was in the press very recently is the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation that put in $1 million to support a program that we had already been supporting in Eastern DRC. And that's very exciting, and it's one way that we also, as a donor, take responsibility to try and address some of the challenges faced by conservation organizations on the ground. There isn't enough money, and we need to do everything, and everybody needs to work all together to try and increase the pot that's available, but also decrease the competition over that pot. So that's a brief description of Arcus, and obviously we're very, very willing to talk more and give you more information if you have other questions. What we'd really like to do now is ask you a few questions and ask you to tell us what donors can do better, should do more of, or should not do at all. And I know that many of you spend way more time than you'd like on fundraising. And that's writing proposals, that's also writing the reports, the grant reports, it's managing your donor relationships and schmoozing with them. And so I think it would be interesting to hear, can anybody give us an estimate of the amount, the proportion of time? Yes, is it Damien?
Proportion of time.
Here comes the mic.
Sorry, I was going to go into another question. It's all right.
Oh, okay, well, let's ask my question first, and then you can ask your question. Does anybody want to give us an indication, just an estimate, on the time that you have in your job? How much do you spend on everything that has to do with fundraising and trying to raise the money? 25% of their time. And that's time that they would otherwise be spending on conservation work and getting the work done. So whether it's 25 or more, it's a huge proportion of time. And so trying to figure out ways to make that less challenging, or maybe get donors together so that the same amount of work can benefit more than one donor would certainly help. I'm going to go to, is it Damien? I couldn't see very well. Yeah, why don't you ask your question?
Okay, thanks very much. My name's Damien Mander from the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. I'll just throw a few stats out there and numbers first before I ask my question. At the International Peace Institute Policy Forum earlier in the year in Germany, the Director of Philanthropy from Africa Parks got up and said that if in 10 years' time in Africa we have 50% of the wildlife left that is there now, that's a success. If in 50 years' time there's a handful of parks in Africa where people can go and see wildlife, then that is a success. And that for me is a big worry, considering that 1 in 13 people on the African continent are employed through tourism. We've actually entered a sixth mass extinction, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. There was a study done last year on the cost of conservation, protecting these conservation areas around the world, protected areas, and the figure was put at $76 billion. The potential fallout in ecological loss in not protecting these areas was estimated at between $2 and $6 trillion. The people in this room function on a shoestring, and we're not defending lines on a map. We're protecting the heart and lungs of this planet. I want to know where we're going to get that $76 billion from, please.
We have to take an integrated approach, and we have to stop working individually to compete for funding. It's not going to be easy to do that, because we have to take programs that were previously very siloed and are not used to a collaborative funding approach. But with such a thing, and especially since there's a wave of interest from private sector, which among others the World Bank played a major role in connecting private sector to commit to finding funding. We need a completely, what was it Michael said last night, an inverse approach from what we've taken before to get it. Personally, I think the money is there. Personally, I think it can pay off. But if you just pitch it on trying to save great apes only, if you don't integrate the poverty eradication objective or the food security objective and other cross issues that are vital to the countries you work in, I don't think you will get the money you need. Okay, well, we just have to stop whining and really, frankly, get an aggressive program to do what we're talking about.
I very much sympathize with those sentiments. I think we live in an imperfect world, and we have to. I remember reading once that conservation is basically the balance between what you'd like the world to be and what it is, and so we have to deal with the world as it is. I think you have to keep making the case for great apes, for biodiversity in general, for ecosystem services from natural habitats. Keep making the case, don't give up on that. And then look for new sources of funding, such as where there are elements of the private sector, such as the extractive industries. I think it's okay. From an NGO standpoint, some people see it as making a deal with the devil. I think it's okay as long as you drive a hard bargain. We have to be pragmatic about it. There's a saying along those lines: the money may be tainted, but it ain't enough. So, and then also one thing that I've been trying to promote, and the World Bank is moving towards, is trying to get more money from infrastructure projects to deal with biodiversity and natural habitats as offsets, as enhancements. But it's not going to be perfect. And then the other thing is to reduce the amount of money that's spent on destruction, finding more benign alternatives to achieve development objectives. But we live in an imperfect world. We're not going to get all the money we want right away. We just have to keep working at it.
And there are critics out there who are saying this is just another talking shop in a luxury hotel in a beautiful part of the world that has very little to do with great apes. So I wonder if in this session, anyone who has decision-making power might wield it a little bit. I'd like to build on what I've just learned from Annette's presentation and what we were talking about on Sunday in the Conservation Awards that GRASP gave out. I was talking about seeds and matches. And for those who weren't in the room, it's not my usual seed speech where the apes are the seed dispersal agents of the forest, and that's why we need to save them, to save the forest. we're talking about seed funding and matched funding. Now, the seed funding isn't that hard to get, but it's often very small. So if you can get matched funding, you can expand it. So if this new Great Ape Conservation Funding Alliance wanted to match the funding that was given by GRASP and the donor NGOs, CI and Born Free, on Sunday, then those recipients and the ones that we wanted to fund but didn't have enough in the pot to fund could benefit. But specifically, as we're at a wildlife film festival, I've recently been helping 2 different projects, totally unrelated, different filmmakers who have been using crowdfunding. Now, crowdfunding can help a lot. So a filmmaker who's right now in Hong Kong filming ivory on sale for a film in Mandarin and Cantonese to try and reduce the demand in ivory, put a project in conjunction with the Chinese filmmaker on Indiegogo, hoping to get $100,000. He got just over 5,000. It's not enough. He's still doing it, he's just getting into debt as he's doing it. Another film about lions in Ethiopia was on Kickstarter. Bernard Walton, I don't know if he's in the room, but Bernard was trying to raise money from the crowd. But if the crowdfunding wasn't enough, if there was a source of funding from one of the big banks, possibly the World Bank, I wrote to HSBC. HSBC often get criticized. I said, look, great opportunity to clean up your image, create a wildlife conservation film fund. Don't just give money, give match funding. So, George, sorry to put you on the spot, but what about this meeting coming up with a proposal for such a fund? So that the conservation films, which the TV commissioners won't commission, as we all know who've tried to make conservation films using the usual money, they say it's too depressing, people will turn over and watch reality shows on the other side. But they need to be made. And as we know from Madeleine's presentation, even without the sound on the videos, you can, with committed people, get those films out to the people who need to see it if you've got a bit of dosh in your pocket.
Okay.
And yet I know filmmakers who are deep in debt because they're trying to do that without the funding. So
Okay,
hang on,
thanks,
we've got
Ian.
financiers here, we've got filmmakers, we've got conservationists. Something's got to come out of this that is concrete, not just an idea that gets forgotten tomorrow.
Well, I mean, concrete things will come out of this because the whole point of this session is that we hear and listen and can take something away from it. It doesn't mean we'll make the decision while we're sitting on the sofa, but it does mean that something concrete will come out of it. So thank you, Ian. Russ.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to take this way beyond the discussions that we've been having specific to great apes and their habitats and look at the whole issue of how we perceive biodiversity, or if you prefer in some sectors calling it natural capital, and how natural capital has to be central to long-term sustainable development. And we've been engaged with the World Bank and other partners on a number of really interesting initiatives, like maybe George can say something about the WAVES program, Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. And last year we had a meeting in Gaborone, Botswana, where we got 10 African countries and a number of corporations also to sign on to using natural capital, putting natural capital into their national and corporate income accounting procedures. As long as we continue to value natural habitats like tropical rainforests at zero, and if you want to go in and put in an oil palm plantation, the oil palm plantation looks like a good deal. But if you look at the full range of values for their ecosystem services, water, carbon sequestration, et cetera, the dynamic changes very dramatically. This isn't easy to do because we don't even really have the methodologies to do this yet, but this is being studied a lot by the World Bank. At Rio Plus 20, there was this 50-50 initiative where the bank wanted to get 50 countries and 50 corporations to sign on to this process of natural capital in national and corporate income accounting. And I think you wound up with like 60 countries and 90 corporations or something like that. So, George, you probably are at least as versed on this as I am, so maybe you can say something about it. But this is changing the whole perception of how we value nature and not just trying to do it piecemeal with what are relatively small amounts of funding.
The World Bank is a large, complex organization with a lot of things going on, so I probably do not know as much about WAVES as Russ does, if Russ has actually worked with WAVES. It's an initiative, at a high level to, in terms of the big picture, to try to get governments to value their natural capital more. I would say biodiversity is part of natural capital. It's not the same thing as natural capital because a lot of other things, water resources, soils and so on, and even fossil fuel deposits and minerals could be considered natural capital, but certainly biodiversity and natural habitats that harbor the biodiversity that also support ecosystem services is a key concept, and the WAVES is trying to get governments to look beyond just GDP as an indicator of success at the macro level. I think it's a very interesting initiative. I can refer you to colleagues in the bank who know more about it than I do. But I think that's one level to work at, but it's also important to work the nitty-gritty levels on the ground, basically at all of the levels. The on-the-ground level with projects, the intermediate level with where new projects get planned in terms of infrastructure, in terms of land use and so on, and at this very high level of how do we measure success in economic terms, and how to rewrite the economics textbook as it's practically used in a way that more reflects the realities of the planet.
I wanted to take us back to a question that you asked earlier about the amount of time we all spend resourcing ourselves. And I would probably, Ken, I think you indicated 25%. If we were to take that across an entire organization, and I imagine this is where you were heading, Annette, it's a lot higher than that. It's, if we took a look at all of the functions of our organization, be they finance, communications, we're talking about an enormous amount of time and talent that's devoted to that resourcing ourselves function. What I wanted to talk about, and in part the Arcus I think is beginning to lead the way on this, is certain of the functions that I believe are key to delivering success in Great Ape and indeed all conservation are those that are radically underinvested in, like communications. I would even say like finance and the ability to manage finance as well. And one of the things, at least in the US context, that I see precludes that sort of investment are the very structures that evaluate us, like a Charity Navigator and its 4-star ranking that we all, are proud when we attract that, and yet in order to do that, we've necessarily said, look at us, we spend really a small amount of money investing in ourselves, and all of it moving out to program. So I suppose what I wanted to just put out there today is, as somebody who's operating at the organizational level, what would it look like for us if there were far more investment, not in specific projects, but in moving that process upstream so that we spot capable organizations and we invest in those organizations. So we get away from the project-specific financing and we open up and congratulate the organizations that are doing good work and we invest in those. And call it general operations funding, call it whatever you'd like to, but I'd love to see far more rigorous upstream analysis that moves us away from the project-by-project financing that consumes an enormous amount of time and talent.
Totally agree, and there has been, there was a period about a decade, 5-6 years ago, it came to the peak where donors would refuse to pay any administrative costs at all. And so I've raised about 18 million for our program, which includes huge communications. So, little plug, at 1:30, I'm showing the short film winners down in Antelope One from the International Forest Film Festival, which had over 1 million people watching. But to go to the funding part, I turned down $1 million from the Germany because of 2 reasons. One, they weren't pursuing, they had interest in doing investment in something that wasn't our core program. And 2, they wouldn't cover administrative costs. And I said no. And I've told donors from then on, I have to have a percentage that goes to hiring the staff, hiring the consultants, and finding the right people to do the right job. And amazingly, it's worked out. More donors now, I'm finding, are open to that if you give them a budget which shows how this links, how these costs link actually to what your purpose and objective is. And so in some senses, we have to get tough really, and put our foot down and say, you know, sorry, we can't accept your money because it's going to decimate us in order to do that project without the capacity to carry it out.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to make a general point and a kind of plea, if you like, for accountability and more efficient spending of existing funds. I mean, I think over the last few days we've heard lots of great projects, make us all feel great, but I've seen very little in terms of hard data on how it's impacting ape populations in terms of population numbers, and I've seen very little hard data on how it's affecting threats facing apes, such as poaching, trafficking, and loss of habitat. There's a few exceptions here, mountain gorillas, for example, but in general, I've seen very little of that. And I think donors should be insisting this from project grantees. You should be putting the onus on people like us to demonstrate with clear metrics, not just kind of fuzzy, yeah, it's going to help apes, but clear metrics on how it's helping ape populations and threats that are directly facing ape populations. And I think donors should start adopting this sort of more business-like approach to conservation given the situation we're facing.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you want an answer to that or whether you're happy with us nodding.
No, I mean, it's just a
Yeah.
general point, but I really
Yeah.
think that it's sort of it's a responsibility of donors as well as of the project grantees to be demanding this, so that we really are putting money in the right places.
Yeah, and we are nodding because we totally agree with you. Yes, Johannes, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Johannes from GRASP. I would like to add one point to the discussion. You both, Jen and George, you mentioned the new initiatives like Red Plus and others, and Jen said very clearly, if you only look at great ape conservation, you're not going far. You need to look into poverty, eradication, etc. What I've seen so far is that in these new initiatives, there are many more benefits than just the financial benefits. I've been pretty much involved in RED, and we all see that there are potential benefits for biodiversity. But there are many others, such as that with RED, it's basically an interministerial approach. You have the chance to reach out to ministries you normally never reach. And I mean, we were struggling over years and years even to get to the Minister of Environment. With RED, and I've been on a number of UN RED missions, we go to the Prime Minister's office, we go to an interministerial body, we talk to the Ministry of Energy, Mining, Forestry. We never had that chance before. And RED Plus is not the only option, there are many more. And I give you a few examples which are probably not very well known in that environment here. For example, the Mayombe. Mayombe is a transboundary initiative shared by 4 countries, the 2 Congos, Gabon, and Angola. We didn't start it as a Great Ape initiative. In Angola, it's clearly linked to a national pacification process in Cabinda. But we have a positive effect because there's a within the national budget, there's an allocation for Mayombe. And Angola is gazetting a national park and will use a couple of $1 million exclusively for Cabinda province. We never had that impact before. Within the UN family, and you're very well aware of the different UN agencies, a lot is linked to conflict resolution, peace building. It's an area, traditionally, we as Great Ape experts, we're not working in. But we have a couple of grants where we basically could show that the environment, Great Apes, can help as a peace-building tool. I mean, Annette is an expert in this. She can clearly support this. But it's, again, an area where traditionally we haven't worked. So what I would like to urge us, we as a conservation people, to be creative, what we can do, and look much beyond Great Ape conservation. And then the multilateral bodies, such as the GEF, the World Bank, and others, they can try to find out options for innovative funding, and GRASP can be the catalysator within that process. And I guess we are more than happy to facilitate that process. Thank you.
I couldn't underscore the point that Katie made more. That was the point I was going to make. I beg funders to really rethink the way they're investing in the people that are on the front lines. The second piece of it, I have Arcus to thank for appreciating the complexity of the program I have the privilege to lead, Health and Harmony, but I cannot say the same of other funders. We put in proposal after proposal, and we're told, that's too complicated. And in fact, what it is complicated and complex. It is working at the very edge, on the very forefront of conservation, healthcare, and training alternative livelihoods that is preserving the habitat for the great apes, that is preserving the health of the people, that is providing training alternative livelihoods so they're not practicing slash and burn agriculture. They're not going to work for the palm oil plantations because they have meaningful livelihoods. But again and again, we're greeted with this confused look, that's just too complicated for us. So I beg funders to create forums for those of us that do have complicated programs to come to you and have a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue about what funding might look like that is really effective on the ground.
You know, earlier this week we saw the film Green, and in the credits was the World Bank. The destruction of the Indonesian forest was brought to us by the World Bank. And I just recently looked up some funding that the World Bank had given to the DRC for railroads to provide ease of mineral transport and also for palm oil, to build more palm oil plantations, presumably. I feel like we have a huge disparity between the amount of money that's going to extractive industries versus conservation. And although I applaud the World Bank efforts to increase its funding of biodiversity and conservation efforts, I'm curious what percentage actually goes to the extractive industries, and how can we not only increase funding for conservation, but perhaps decrease funding for extractive industries? Because I just feel like there's this incredible disparity, and you know, the $76 billion, where is that going to come from? And so perhaps that's another avenue to look at, to put more conditions on funding to these industries.
I don't know the specifics of the railway case. I'd be happy to discuss it offline and then refer you to whoever's in charge. The private sector affiliate of the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, IFC, works a lot with extractive industries, and I think the standard for requiring attention to biodiversity is quite strong, Performance Standard 6. The challenge is making sure that it's implemented, and certainly that's where NGOs can play a very useful watchdog role. If there's something that's not being done the way it should be, then that's something we need to know about. One thing that you should be aware of is that the World Bank has become quite transparent. We have an access to information policy, which basically has a presumption that information is to be made public, and there are certain exceptions, but the presumption is generally to be as transparent as possible. We're trying to lead by example in terms of showing our member governments how we can be more transparent. So you should be able to find out about that project and engage with whoever is the focal point for that. I think in principle, if there's a linear project that opens up new areas, there needs to be attention to the induced impacts on biodiversity. And that may mean changing the alignment of where a road or railway goes. It may mean protecting the area alongside the road or railway to try to minimize the deforestation that would happen along the sides and the hunting. Or it can mean an offset, protecting another area. I don't know if any of those approaches were used in that project, but certainly you can have a look and compare it with the Performance Standard 6 and see if there's a gap, and then bring it to the attention of whoever needs to know about it.
Yeah, I guess for me it's just more illustrative. It was a $290 million project. That's one project in one country, versus Arcus's generous funding of $9 million. There's such a huge disparity there. And I feel like there's going to have to be sort of a top-down approach from the World Bank and other major funders with the funding base that you have.
Yeah. So just one last point on that. The extractive industries are literally sitting on a gold mine or other very valuable minerals. They'll have a lot of money. They'll be able to mobilize lots of resources. I think the challenge is to get some of that, even a tiny proportion of that money into conservation as biodiversity offsets to help increase the amount of money that goes into conservation. But the products of the extractive industries, whether it's minerals or fossil fuels, are used globally. They're going to be around, and it's a matter of how they can do what they need to do in a way that minimizes the damage, and how they can help give back somewhat through funding for biodiversity.
I agree with that, George, in terms of, on the scale, there's a lot of money there, and we should tap into it. I also think about, I liked your comment, Annette, about longer-term financing for the, in partnering, because I think looking at land managers, you look at places like, we have a lot of Ugandans here, and the need to work with private landowners and the potential to work with them. But, to manage land, that was a great promise of RED. The idea that you possibly could pay people to actually manage. But, it's not been coming about. But if we could figure out really innovative ways to create incentives for landowners to manage appropriately, for manage in a way that we think is good for conservation, and pay farmers a 10-year contract that you will manage it this way, you will be monitored in such a way, get the metrics that Emma mentioned, we might be able to, even it may not be at the great scale of what the extractives are, but they could play a key role within the landscape. And they might even be able to build some advocacy for conservation. Wait a minute, my land is being managed for conservation, and I'm getting paid for this, and therefore I'm committed to this. And maybe that kind of advocacy would be really useful. When I was in Peru in last April, it took me about 2 hours to go about 3 blocks because there were 1,000 people marching against a mining company because they were concerned about their ecosystem services and they weren't being attracted. We don't have that kind of civil society response yet in Africa, but we really need to build it. And maybe some of these ways of putting money into commitments for conservation could be really important. But it does need a long-term, accompaniment.
Thank you for that, Ray.
This is kind of an observation with regards to trying to couch all of our ideas that we're seeing in different areas towards protecting biodiversity. And I'm wondering how we really do that. Working in the field with applied research, we come up with good ideas with regards to forestry, easy area to work in terms of like forming ideas and some results, and then anti-poaching. There's a lot of different people working in these areas. And NGOs they're working with their NGOs, but there are a lot of people doing the same stuff in just kind of different ways. And I was wondering if GRASP could form kind of a place that these NGOs could go to put their ideas together, come up with these ideas, put them together so they can approach some of these larger World Bank organizations with, okay, here are the 5 points that these sites across Africa are these major things, anti-poaching or helping people. These are the good ideas that they've got on the ground. These are working, and this is who we can go to get more funding from these organizations. Because as it is now, it just seems like particular NGOs are going after a little bit of money here. Other NGOs are going after money in other areas. It's kind of the same ideas, but and GRASP could be that organization that takes all those ideas and takes it to a higher level.
Thank you very much for that. And I won't speak for GRASP because I don't think I'm allowed to. But Doug, do you want to comment?
You're absolutely right, though. GRASP was, and probably Ian Redmond could tell better than others here since he was there at the launch of GRASP and was one of the masterminds behind GRASP. My perception of GRASP is that it was crafted with that in mind, to give the collective might to speak with a stronger voice and to access the offices and the resources and the initiatives that none of us individually can. And that's why it's a partnership. And GRASP actually changed its name from Great Ape Survival Project to Great Ape Survival Partnership about halfway through its current life, because it becomes something more than just a project. I think we would happily take that responsibility on, and we would actually seek it out. We want our partners to invest in GRASP in that way, because your interest in accessing some of these opportunities is what makes the partnership stronger. And if there's no added value to being together in a room like this, or being in a partnership like GRASP, then I think we all know the result, because we're living it too often. So certainly I think not just funding, but political advocacy. So many of the priorities that GRASP has in these documents you see on some of the desks are ones you should access from us or seek from us. You should hold us accountable, too. We're almost an elected official to some degree for the partners. We have councils and committees that task us, and those kinds of jobs are the ones we've agreed to take on. We are housed inside the United Nations. You can't get much farther up the food chain than that, and certainly, as Johannes would agree, we are literally side-by-side office-wise with the UN RED programs. I mean, we see them every single day. The conversations are daily. The overlap is exciting, the potential is high, and I would just, if I could, just one thing. Jan was talking before in response to Damien's question about, a number, $76 billion. And I guarantee you couldn't get that overnight, even if you were Steven Spielberg. It doesn't happen. But it already is there. And I think it's up to us to change our argument and change our approach to funding to be able to access a lot of that money. It really is there. And just to finish on my little soapbox, whatever this thing is, we have the single greatest asset in the world for fundraising. And I can tell you this, and I think Johannes would agree, almost every single day someone comes in my office at UNEP and says, can we get apes into this proposal? I know it's for oceans, but apes are so good. There's always that push. We have this incredible magnet in great apes. They are an entry point to almost anything you want to save on this earth, mostly speaking, but whether it's a mountain or a forest, if it's water, if it's climate change, if it is community engagement, if it is peace building, if it's transboundary agreements, apes are so often the easy way into that. And that is where money can be found, that's where resources can be found, that's where change can be found. So thanks.
So unfortunately, we have to wrap up this session, so we can't carry on with the conversation, although I would have loved to have carried on a bit longer. But what I would like to ask you is to please not stop this conversation and continue to help us and give us your advice and give us your comments on how we can be more effective to support the work. Certainly speaking for myself, but I'm sure George and Jan would agree. I mean, our objectives are the same as yours, and that's why we're here. And so we are maybe in a slightly different chair than you're in, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be telling us how to do it better and how to help you better. So thanks very much, but please let's not stop the conversation. Thank you.